The 90s are a special time for me. I was born in 1995, and so my memories of 1998 and 1999 are covered in a hazy fog, as if each scene from my past was locked in some limbo of Silent Hill. The 90s created the backbone of my late 90s and early 2000s gaming experiences. 98 and 99 were defined by the SNES, with Mega Man X being the first game I remember distinctly ever playing. But at the turn of the century, the PS1 would enter my life, and early polygonal games dominated my early gaming landscape, with games like Spyro Year of the Dragon being the first game I remember rolling credits on all the way back in the year 2000. I grew up in a gaming world with 5th generation consoles and Windows 95s and 98s. Extending my memory draw distance, I'm ranking my top 10 games of the 90s. You're watching Rail Deal Games, and let's dive right in. Number 10. Super Metroid was an interesting game to play in the late 90s because most of my memories of this game revolve around watching my brother Kyle play, with my dad doing commentary. You see, my dad played the original Metroid in the 80s, charting his own course with his own hand-drawn maps. And I distinctly remember how his mind was blown when my brother first pulled up the in-game map. A theme of my early gaming life is that I would watch my brothers or dad play a game, and I would never play the game myself. And Super Metroid fell into this category until I finally played it for the first time in 2018. Despite some of the odd controls in terms of modern expectations, Super Metroid is either my second or third favorite Metroidvania of all time. Alien is my favorite movie ever made, and Super Metroid is clearly designed in such a way that is inspired by that 1979 masterpiece. I love the dark, the oddity of the environment, and the music. My god, the music in this game is god tier. Combine all of this with a Metroidvania loop that hasn't aged a day, and this truly is one of the greatest games ever made. Number 9. About midway through the time my family would game exclusively on the PS1, my brother would get a copy of Parasite Eve. As a family, we had already fallen deeply in love with the Final Fantasy franchise, so the innovations Parasite Eve made upon the typical JRPG turn-based formula shook our preconceptions of what turn-based combat could be to the foundation. Admittedly, the story in this game doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it provides enough of a narrative backdrop to justify the biomagic powers of Aya Brea and the Thing-esque monsters of the game. Beyond Vagrant's story, this style of JRPG combat never really took off, and it is kind of a shame. I honestly think the JRPG genre wouldn't have taken such a massive plummet in popularity during the 2000s if they had properly adapted to meet the growing trends towards more action-based gameplay in the late 90s. Combining Resident Evil and Final Fantasy is such a big-brain slam dunk move, and even though this style of game never got very far, I'm happy we got to see such a strong game out of that conflux of ideas. Number 8. Half-Life changed the FPS game when it released. Launching in a landscape of arena shooters and Doom clones, which we now call boomer shooters, Half-Life cast aside everything the budding FPS genre cared about and instead created a game that focused on story, both atmospheric and vocalized. I remember watching my dad boot this game up for the first time, and the train section at the beginning of the game surprised my young brain to no end. Nothing was happening in that scene, but I couldn't look away from the screen because that scene, despite being slow, is atmospheric. Half-Life is the game that made me look up at the ceiling to look for vents every time I went into a dark room for my first few years of elementary school. It's this game that made Halo possible at the turn of the 2000s, and in a lot of ways, Half-Life perfected the atmospheric shooter story in a way that no other game has since. A lot of modern games just won't take the risk to slow down the game to set up an atmosphere, and the last game I can think of that did something like this is Red Dead Redemption 2. Slow atmospheric starts are underrated in the modern gaming landscape, but the 90s were just different. Developers weren't scared to start off slow, giving the world time to immerse the player before introducing the critical crux of the story. As I get older, I appreciate that feature of older games in a way I just didn't when I was younger. Number 7. In terms of immersive worlds, Fallout is one of a kind. Nowadays, Fallout is a commonly known franchise, but during the 90s, that wasn't the case. This game is why I appreciate games that have canonical game over states, and what I mean by that is that Fallout is a game that will force you to restart if you you don't finish the main quest quickly enough. At the beginning of the game, the player is tasked with finding a water chip to save Vault 13, and if the player doesn't find it in time, all of Vault 13's citizens are killed and the game is done. Likewise, if the player gets too irradiated, the player will instantly die, eliciting a game over screen. If the player didn't keep a save back to revert to, the game is done and the player reached a canonical conclusion and dead end. It's a game design philosophy that doesn't exist any longer, but during the 90s, it was actually a fairly common aspect of the way older games were designed. I really had to think between Fallout and Fallout 2 for the top 10 of this list, but I chose to go with Fallout because its immersive design makes it my favorite game in the franchise. It's the smallest game of the numbered entries, but a game being short just means I'll have the ability to replay it. Fallout is likely the first ever choices matter type of Western RPG, and it would start a trend of stellar CRPGs dropping year after year in the late 90s, with Baldur's Gate following at its heels the very next year. Number 6. Growing up, my brothers and I would gather around late at night to watch our dad play the original Resident Evil trilogy. For almost my whole childhood, Resident Evil was a franchise I would watch be played and would never play myself. It was only after I was already 17 that I started going back to play these classic RE games. Like Fallout, it was hard to pick a favorite of the three for this list, but I decided to go with Resident Evil 3 Nemesis because it is the only game in the PSX trilogy to create a feeling of dread for me when I personally played. I just really liked the framing of Jill versus Nemi as the core conflict of the game, and this game felt far more dangerous than the first two games in the franchise. The tank control era of RE games get a bad rap in the modern gaming discourse, but I wouldn't be shocked to learn a lot of people who complain about tank controls haven't actually given them a fair shot. I remember when I started playing through these classic titles in my early adulthood, I expected the movement in the game to be clunky and hard to learn, but I picked it up right away with no issue whatsoever. I wish more tank control games would come out, honestly, because it is sometimes refreshing to jump back into these old games to experience a movement system that is different from the way all modern games play. The variety is nice. Number 5. Movement was king in the Doom clone and arena shooter era of FPS history. Unreal Tournament is my favorite arena shooter ever made, and I played the PS2 port of this game religiously when I was a child in the early 2000s. I would play the game with modifiers on too, including one-shot kills, 2x speed, and half speed. I played this game every which way and perfected every level on max difficulty. My cousin and I would do 8 to 10 hour sessions of this game sometimes, just grinding away at every level in the game. I really wish a game like this would come out on modern hardware because I'd love to play an arena shooter like this online sometime. Movement is something a lot of modern shooters just don't get right at all, and I've always favored the always sprinting, rocket jumping, hectic fights in games like Unreal Tournament. I also think Unreal Tournament has the best multiplayer capture the flag level with facing worlds. It's small, but that is part of what makes it so good. It makes map knowledge easy to gain, instead focusing on a mastery of gameplay systems. 2v2 or 3v3 matches on this map is something I wish I could get back from my childhood. Number 4. Controllers didn't always have analog sticks. When the N64 came out, it had an odd design not exclusively because it's a chunky monstrosity, but because of the fact it had an analog stick dead center in the middle. Console gaming with an analog stick was novel at the time, and a few years later, Sony would innovate on that idea with the first ever DualShock controller, the first console controller with 2 analog sticks. At the time, Sony was the only player in the market with a controller like that, so they capitalized on their monopoly by releasing the first ever dual analog controlled game, Ape Escape. Collectathons were a huge trend in the late 90s, with Spyro, Banjo-Kazooie, and Super Mario 64 being the most notable examples. In a lot of ways, the platformer genre is synonymous with the collectathon, but Ape Escape flipped the collectathon loop on its head a little bit by making the main collectible apes, some of which can be the most difficult enemy types in the game as well. Each level has a certain number of apes on them for the player to collect, and just like the Spyro games, the player needs to come back with new powers in order to fully complete each level. My favorite apes are the sunglass gun-toting ones, and one of the features of this game I really enjoyed is the way the monkey radar would give you a description of each ape's personality. Pairing this with the god-tier level design, Ape Escape is genuinely one of the best 3D platformers ever made. I wish the Ape Escape franchise would see a comeback. Over the course of the 2000s, platformers went the way of the dodo, other than Mario of course, and in this day and age, a new Ape Escape game would be a nice change of pace for Sony Studios. I really like smaller, gameplay-focused games nowadays, and that's what Ape Escape could be once again. Number 3. Doom made PC gaming a viable marketplace. There was a trend a couple years back where people would try to get Doom to run on a variety of electronics, from refrigerators to pregnancy tests. And you see, Doom was just designed in such a way that it can run on pretty much anything with a potato charge. It was designed that way because PCs at the time just were wildly all over the place, and so it made sense to design the software of the game to run on literally anything. And Doom has my favorite video game sprite of all time as well, the Cacodemon dying animation. Doom has held a special place in my gaming history for essentially my whole life. I love Doom, and to this day, it is one of my favorite FPS games ever made. And it would be a close contest between the 1993 original and the 2016 reboot as to which I would consider the best FPS game of all time. The combination of music, level design, and the best goddamn shotgun gaming has ever seen makes Doom just have a gameplay loop that is undefeated in the boomer shooter subgenre to this very day. And I love to do a playthrough of this game every handful of years because it's such a comforting and nostalgic experience. Number 2. My second favorite game ever made is Age of Empires 2. I played AoE 2 for the first time in high school, and this game is the reason I'm a history buff today. I learned to love history through the RP AoE 2 provides, and I would spend countless hours growing up in the scenario editor crafting intricate and complex stories over the course of 60 to 70 levels. I only ever half finished my work on that, and now all that work is gone because it was on my brother's Windows XP, and that thing is long gone as well. It's a damn shame because I actually was really confident about that story, and I really should consider maybe turning it into a novel. I do basically remember everything about it to this very day. I love literally everything about this game. I love the tech trees, the comprehensive collection of civilizations, the scenario editor, the campaigns, and playing with friends are all 10 out of 10 experiences for me. To this day, AoE 2 is my second most played game of all time, and I roughly estimate I've spent over 700 hours in this game. It's actually possible it's my most played game of all time, but I don't know how much time I actually spent in high school playing it. I would pump 20 to 35 hours every weekend at my grandma's house for months straight, and this would only end when I got a PS3 and finally started the 7th generation gaming era of my life in 2011. If you would like to see me rank all of the civilizations in this game sometime, please let me know. I love this game, and I would totally be down to do that whenever I get a PC I can record gameplay of it on. And with that, there's only one game that had any remote chance of topping AoE 2 for me. AoE 2 is my second favorite game of all time, which means the number one entry on this list is my favorite game ever made. Number 1. I love Final Fantasy Tactics. I learned how to read while playing this game, and I remember there was a time when my brothers and dad would each play this game during our video game time. You see, the way it worked when I was growing up is that each of us got an hour to play before we would need to get off and allow the next person a turn to play. When my dad discovered this game and shared it with us, this game never left the console, and we would each take our hour turn on it, and we did this for several months. I've done it all in this game. I've bricked a save in Rio Vane's castle, I've gotten Cloud, reached the bottom of the dark dungeon, and rolled credits. My favorite way to play this game now is to set up a picker wheel with all of the jobs in the game, random 6 of them, and do an Iron Man perma-save death run using only the 6 jobs I random. The NVIDIA leak a couple years back revealed that a Tactics remaster should be coming to modern hardware at some point, and whenever that happens, I'm dropping whatever I'm playing at that time to pick it up and get the platinum. Whenever that finally drops, I plan to start doing a perma-death run every year because the only reason I haven't done a playthrough in a long time is because I don't bust my PS3 out that often anymore. I've played a lot of Tactics wannabes over the years too, but none of them hold a candle to the best game ever made. And that's the video, my guys. What's your favorite game of the 90s? Let me know in the comments section below. There are so many high quality games to choose from that it was impossible to include all of the games I love from this decade, and I plan to do a top 25 games of the 90s later on this year. If you'd like to see that and other Rail Deal gaming content, please subscribe to the channel and share with your friends. If you have a moment right now, consider checking out my top 10 games of the 80s list or the other video on the screen. Whatever you choose to do, have an awesome day, gamers.